while we're getting this ready, I think my role here tonight is to be a little controversial. Before David comes on, David will also be controversial, I know, because he and I both spoke on the same program down in Melbourne the other day. But if I have you going out of here tonight saying that was all crap, what he talked about today, that's good. At least you're talking about something. And so what I want to do is discuss this notion of whether it is obesity or whether there's something behind this that we need to be looking at rather than obesity per se. These are the latest figures on obesity mortality rates as measured by BMI, and we know that BMI is not a good measure at the individual level, but at the population level. And when you've got 4 million people, as in all these studies, it's a pretty good indication. And you can see that men have a higher mortality risk than women with a higher body mass index. But we have to then look at causality. And from an epidemiological perspective, it's very difficult to talk about causality when you're talking about chronic disease. It's easy when you're talking about infectious diseases, but not so much with chronic disease. And so what we have to do in chronic disease, much more so than infectious diseases, is not just look at the disease and the risk factors and the markers, and there's debate about whether obesity is a disease or a risk factor or a marker. I tend to fall in the latter category of believing this. And quite often in clinical practice, we just stop at that level and deal with the risk factors. But of course, Geoffrey Rose, the famous English epidemiologist, said that you've got to just not look at the cause, these are the proximal causes, the immediate causes of those risk factors and markers and so on. But you've got to look at the cause of the cause and then the cause of the cause of the cause. And I was delighted to see that Stephen was talking earlier about how the centre is set up here to actually look at these three levels, because at this level we're talking about public health and we haven't done very well. I'm a total failure when it comes to obesity. I've worked in this area for 30 years, and at a populational level you can say I've done nothing because we're still getting fatter. But the small numbers of individuals that I've worked with, I've been very successful with the Gutbuster program and other programs. And that's at this level that we're dealing, which is the clinical health level. Now, both of these areas have their problems, but governments and other bodies aren't looking so much at the public health level, and I was pleased to see that that's what the Charles Perkins Centre is doing here. I'm going to focus on the other level tonight, and I'm going to look at just what the complications with that are with dealing with even the individual approach to obesity. The old linear approach was that weight equals energy in minus energy out, and Steve also pointed out that this doesn't work. This notion that we've had since the year dot, basically, you change the food that you take in, the energy that you expend, and you will lose weight. Boyd Swinburne and I came up, and I'm going to quote, pardon my indulgence, but I'll quote a little bit of my own work tonight. We came up with this in 1996. It's a pseudo-systems approach, which said that it's a little more than just a linear approach to obesity. This has already been used by Steve, so I won't spend any time on it, but this was the Forsyth report's approach to looking at a systems approach, basically. It was extending the old linear approach in some way, but as you can see, every point on that graph is another point, so everything interacts with everything else, and it's totally useless in terms of dealing with obesity, either at the individual or the population level. In fact, it's used at talks like this for jokes to show people how difficult it is to work in obesity. Solving a complex issue like obesity may require a significant shift in thinking from linear cause and effect to non-linear systems-wide dynamics. And strangely enough, even though Bob Kushner, who's well known in the obesity community, looks a bit like a used car salesman, and you might not buy the book because of that, but he was one of the first ones that said there are different people that fit into different patterns of eaters, different patterns of exercises, and different patterns of copers. And he came up with 6 different types of each, so there's 18 different types. So we're getting closer to looking at the systems approach, which really gets down to an individual model, which in theory at least, we need 7 billion programs in the world for dealing with obesity because we've got 7 billion people. This guy, Tariq Hamed, which a lot of people even working in obesity haven't heard of, is a systems theory analyst who came up with this book in 2009, Thinking in Circles about Obesity. And he defined quite clearly that we have to start thinking differently, away from the linear model, if we're going to deal with obesity, at least at the clinical level. And his latest book, which has only just come out, and I've just finished reading it, he's actually extended that now to an app where you can individually put in your own details and it will give you a printout of what's the appropriate program for you for losing weight. Because we know if you get 1,000 people and you put them on exactly the same program for weight loss, you will get this normal curve. Some will lose nothing and some will lose a lot, and you'll have this group in the middle. So it just doesn't work, the old notion. And one of the reasons, one of the problems with this is that we've got different categories of overweight. We've got the lean and metabolically healthy, and they make up about 1/3 of the population. We've got the overweight but metabolically normal. They're called obnies, or obese but metabolically normal individuals. The other term is FOTI, which is fat on the outside or and thin on the inside. And they're about 30%. Now these percentages differ from different studies, but this is roughly the percentages we've got. The lean but metabolically unhealthy, and the overweight and metabolically unhealthy. So there's something funny going on in obesity that means that it's not just obesity. We're not just dealing with overweight as a potential cause of chronic disease. And since the discovery of well, we've known for 2,500 years about inflammation, and Aurelius Celsus, the Greek physician, talked about this long time ago. But it's only 1994 that we've come up with this new model, or this new problem of what the guy who discovered it, Gökhan Ertemishliegel from Harvard University, called metaflammation. And this is where you don't have a microbial pathogen or an antigen, but you've got a lifestyle or an environmental inducer. And as you can see in the picture here, the classical inflammation is flaming and happens quickly, and you get a return to homeostasis, which occurs mainly with infectious diseases. The metaflammation, low-grade systemic chronic inflammation, is smouldering coals, which works through oxidative stress, metaflammation, insulin resistance, leading on to dysmetabolism and chronic allostasis. So a different type of inflammation. And this is only 1994 it was first found. And it was initially thought to be associated with obesity. But after that, there were several papers came out, including some of our own, that suggested that metaflammation isn't just associated with obesity. It can also be associated with the factors that cause obesity without getting fat. And John Dixon and myself did this study. We've published several articles in this area a few years ago to show that all of these factors can lead on to metaflammation, but many of them don't go through obesity. In fact, you don't get fat by starving, and you still develop this low-grade systemic inflammation, which is similar to the other form, which then may lead on to chronic disease. I'm not saying it causes, just saying it leads on to those other problems. And more recently, we've known that this is channeled through the gut microbiota, which if we had more time, we could spend a lot more time talking about this. So the types of problems, the types of determinants that made up that first slide I talked about, the 3 different levels, are a bit like an iceberg model, a systems model with an iceberg. We tend to look at weight control as nutrition, activity, and sometimes, and I'm talking about the popular media, sometimes stress. But it's everything that goes on under the water that interacts with each other that makes this a systems model, and which makes it much more difficult to deal with. And when we look at what those determinants are, and I'll redefine what I put up in the first slide, epidemiologists, of course, always love acronyms, so we like to come up with an acronym that defines what we're talking about. So far, we've got nasty odours here. And as you can see, nutrition, activity, and stress are up the top there. I won't go into all the others, but there's some interesting ones, but Stephen talked about some of them: sleep, the environment, relationships and social inequality are 2 areas Michael Marmot has dealt with in England, for example, that are most important, and then can lead on to obesity, that can lead on to metaflammation, but don't necessarily lead on to obesity before they lead to chronic disease. We've added nasty malodors now, because we found in working in Indigenous communities that meaninglessness, alienation, loss of cultural identity are most important for development of metaflammation and potentially chronic disease. And you'll see the little asterisks there as the level of evidence that each of these determinants have metaflammation associated with them. But as you can see, they don't all lead through obesity to chronic disease. So I want to switch tack then now and say, well, how do we deal with this? Because all of these factors make up the knowledge base that we use in lifestyle medicine. And the components of lifestyle medicine are these four things here: the knowledge, the skills, the tools, and the procedures. And I'm going to spend the last 5 minutes here talking about the procedures, because this is where I think lifestyle medicine has something to add. It's not a new form of clinical practice, and it's not just medicine, it's other forms of clinical practice. It's not a new form, it's an adjunct form. But what can we add that is slightly different? Well, the procedures is one area, and there are several different procedures, but I just want to focus on one, and this is one that we've concerned ourselves with over the last 3 years, and that's shared medical appointments. This is where you have a doctor not just consulting one person. As we saw before, one-on-one doesn't work very well with obesity. And in fact, there's no reason why we should have this clinical approach to one-on-one. If you look through the literature, there's no superiority of a one-on-one clinical approach to any other clinical approach that you'll find. It's just something that we've developed with over thousands of years. Shared medical appointments fit somewhere between the one-on-one model, which is one doctor with one patient, or one clinician with one patient, and the group education model at the other end, which is one educator, 50 to 20 patients. Now, at that end, there's no medical input, but there's education. At the other end, there's medical input, but there's not enough time for education. So the shared medical appointment idea has one doctor, one facilitator, who's generally a practice nurse, but can be a diabetes educator, or an exercise physiologist, or whoever else you want, depending on the problem that you're dealing with. And this has been introduced in the United States quite successfully. You've got up to 12 to 15 patients. We only use 12 here, up to 12 patients. The doctor consults each of them individually, and the facilitator drives the show over an hour of the doctor's time. We have asked Medicare for a special item number for this over 3 years. It's gone backwards and forwards as to whether we can fit into the current item numbers. They said we don't, because you have to have, to claim as an item 23, you have to have one doctor on one occasion with one patient. We said we have got one doctor on one occasion with one patient, there's just 11 others watching. and contributing, because that's the whole process. You get peer support from everybody else. As I've said to my doctor, I don't particularly want to talk to you. I'd like to talk to other men like me who've got my problems, but I'd like you in the room to be able to help us if we hit a medical issue. And the doctors like this too, and other clinicians like it, because it means they get a time to relax. So, and they also get support from the other people. There's a number of papers that have been written on this. There's over 500 papers now. We have written quite a few here. We've got half a dozen of the peer-reviewed literature papers. We've got several grey literature papers on this in Australia. This is an example from an RACGP funding grant that we had a couple of years ago. We ran 12, I think it was, shared medical appointments with 222 patients around the country. We were told that it wouldn't work in the country, so we went to Hamish's starting ground where he started Oka Health, and we ran them in Burke. And you can see that's Hamish's back that we're seeing there in the lilac shirt. Interesting story, when we drove out, Hamish said the doctor in the clinic out there in Burke is going to do the doctoring in the clinic. We got there and he was out on a home visit, and Hamish said, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? There's no doctor here. And we said, well, you're a doctor. And he said, but I've never done this before. And we said, doesn't matter, you just do what you do as a doctor. We, as the facilitator, John Stevens and myself, we have to do the hard part. We have to run the group. We have to work out who's going to talk too much and who's not going to talk enough. Bring them out. Make sure you're not here for an hour, more than an hour, and so on. And Hamish did his first one, loved it, and has gone on to bigger and better things since. Just quickly, an evaluation, and I'm just reporting very quickly some Likert scales that we did in our evaluation. You can read this in the reports. When we asked, what do you like most about SMAs? Having more time for asking questions, seeing the doctor more relaxed. And the doctors said, I feel more relaxed too. Getting support from others, hearing experiences of other patients, and getting information from others. And you can see they're all up the 5-point end of the Likert scale. If you get that in a research project, we had one person in 222 who said he probably wouldn't come back to another one of these. All the rest of them, who started off saying they wouldn't come in and disclose their information to other people, once they do sign a confidentiality agreement, by the way, once they came in and did it, they said, I want to come back and do these more. Doesn't mean they're not going to do their normal visits, but it means that you get much more time with each individual patient in this case. So the conclusions to what I'm talking about, there is a hierarchy of determinants leading to obesity. Interventions at the distal or the public health level have been mainly ignored and are largely unsuccessful. And I'd like to have more time to spend on that because I think that area is wide open for discussion. Thirdly, interventions at the proximal or the clinical level have been handicapped by a linear or a physics approach to the problem rather than a systems model approach. And finally, I want to put it to you that obesity is really a canary in the coal mine. Lifestyle and environmental determinants that may or may not lead to obesity, can lead to chronic disease, should be targeted rather than obesity per se. And I say that as somebody who's worked in obesity for 30 years. I'll leave you with, I said I wanted to be controversial, I'll leave you with what I would normally put up. When you are controversial like that, you should really shut up and say nothing. Or if you get caught out, this is the way I'll be acting out in the foyer later on. Thank you very much.